afternoon. And we are going to be giving you an update on our housing element with a focus on the sites in this community. And Lily Thomas, and I work with the Community Development Agency, where I oversee our housing and federal grants program. And I'm also joined by Jillian. Jillian, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Jillian Zeiger. I'm a senior planner in the Housing and Federal Grants Division.
And now I'll turn it over to Joan, who is a consultant with MIG, who's helping us with our housing element update.
Okay, well, thank you, Lily. Welcome, everyone. My name is Joan Chaplik. I'm a principal with MIG, and I'm going to be presenting and also serve as the moderator for tonight's meeting. So we're going to have a presentation, and then after that, we'll take your questions and comments, and we request that you use the raise hands function, and then I'll be calling people and taking us through the time that we have. So we're scheduled through till 7 o'clock. I'm here tonight with my colleague, Jose Rodriguez, who is a land use and housing policy planner. He'll also be a presenter. And then we also have our county staff that will be answering questions. If you want to submit any questions through the chat during the presentation, if you need a bit of clarification, the county staff will respond as we're going through the materials. So with that, I'm going to get started so we can maximize the time that we have to answer your questions. So our agenda, we're going to give you a brief update on the process for developing the housing element. Our big focus tonight is on the process for selecting the potential housing sites that will be in the housing element. Then we're going to walk you through how to use input on the sites using Balancing Act. It's a digital tool. We're also providing office hours. So you'll be able to get one-on-one assistance after this meeting. I believe we have an hour scheduled so that those who are enthusiastic and want to make sure they know how to use the tool can get help from county staff, and then we'll wrap up at around 7 o'clock. In terms of our goals, the county has organized a whole series of presentations across the county so that we can inform the community about the planning process for achieving the housing goals and making sure you understand the site selection process. We want to give you an opportunity to provide your input and introduce Balancing Act. In terms of tonight's meetings, we are here to receive comments and questions. So we have also been to the design review boards, and at those meetings, we have not requested any formal response or position. This is really about information and answering your questions, and then encouraging the use of Balancing Act. So let's do a quick review of the housing element. So this is a plan that is required by state law, by the California Housing and Community Development Department, and it's updated every 8 years. The current cycle for the Marin document needs to be adopted by January 2023. So that's the schedule that we're working on. And just a reminder that the focus of this housing element is covers only the unincorporated areas. So in terms of the housing element is about responding to the RHNA, and that's a term that is used regularly throughout the planning process. And it stands for the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. So this is the determination of the statewide housing needs happens at HCD, and then they make a determination of the RHNAs for each council of government throughout the state. And for the Bay Area, the RHNA number is 441,176 units. Of that, there are 14,200 units for Marin County, and out of that number, for unincorporated Marin County, the RHNA number is 3,569 units. So in terms of the overall total, the county accounts for 3.2% of the total, and the unincorporated county RHNA number represents 25% of the overall Marina County RENA. So with that, we want to focus on the housing units in Marin, and just noticing that between the last cycle, 2013 and 2021, there were 237 units of housing built. And this RENA is obviously much higher than past RENA goals, and that's what the plan will be responding to. So now I'd like to turn it over to Jose Rodriguez, who will be describing the housing site selection process.
Great, thanks, Joan. Yeah, what I want to do is kind of walk through the process of selecting the potential sites and go through and how we'll whittle down, eventually narrow down our list of sites that we'll add to the housing element. There's a process that we want to go through. So first thing is selecting sites. As Joan mentioned, the Housing and Community Development Department, they're going to review the housing element. They'll also look at all of our sites really closely and make sure that we're using a set of criteria to recognize what sites we use, why did we use those sites, how many units we're counting. So some of the key things that we'll look at as HCD reviews our suitability analysis is, what the existing uses are on site. Is it a commercial site? Is it a residential site? A vacant site? What's the realistic potential for redevelopment, site size, the density allowed, in terms of what the countywide plan allows or zoning allows. We'll take all those into account on all the sites that we've selected. Next slide, Joan. One thing I do also want to talk about is the various income levels that the state will be looking at in terms of the sites we identified. As Joan mentioned earlier, there's a certain number of units that need to be addressed in the housing element. And the way we do that is through density. Typically, larger single-family homes are more expensive, and so therefore they're more affordable to an above or a household that obviously makes a little bit more money, above moderate income. As the density gets a little bit higher, so maybe smaller single-family homes on a smaller lot, they become a little bit more affordable. And so as you move through this chart, we go through duplexes, become affordable to moderate households. Accessory dwelling units are also become a little bit more affordable to moderate incomes. And then the lower income is typically more affordable through multifamily development. Now, it doesn't always have to be multifamily. There could be subsidies that provide assistance for someone to be able to afford a house that's under the affordability category. So the key thing in terms of affordability is larger single family homes, more affordable to the above moderate. And then as we move down the density range, lower income is more affordable to the higher density residential. Next slide. The Board of Supervisors has identified a set of key guiding principles to help us identify the sites that we're going to put in the housing element. These guiding principles were affirmed by the Board of Supervisors back in December of 2021. So these guiding principles are ensuring countywide distribution of housing sites, addressing racial equity and historic patterns of segregation, identifying sites within city-centered areas where infill developments, there's greater opportunity for infill development or redevelopment where there's more services and access to employment opportunities. Another guiding principle is considering the environmental hazards, leveraging surplus lands, and that could be school sites, county sites, state-owned sites, California-owned sites. And then lastly, making sure there's a robust public engagement process. So having these types of meetings, and we want to listen to the community, hear your comments and questions. Next slide. So we've identified sites, but to identify those sites, we use various strategies to kind of see where we can put housing throughout the county. And I will recognize it has been a challenge to identify sites. These are the key strategies we've used to identify sites. So the first one is vacant sites. Obviously, where their land is zoned for residential, and if it's a vacant site, we've identified those sites. However, we did factor in constraints on vacant land. We do know that there's hillsides, terrain, steep slopes, but there's other factors to include as well: flooding, biological resources, natural resources. So those are all considered when we calculate units for sites. We also looked at approved and proposed projects that are what we call in the pipeline. Maybe they've received an approval but haven't started construction yet. We can count these units against the RHNA, that number that Joan mentioned, the 3,569. So we can start whittling away that RHNA number based on these strategies. Another strategy is accessory dwelling units. And those are the small units that you can build in your backyard or above a garage. We can count some of those units against the RHNA. I talked about publicly owned land or surplus lands. This could be, again, county sites. It could be vacant sites that I know there's some sites in Marin County that the state owns. The county owns some properties or surplus properties, or maybe reutilize existing properties. Increasing densities in residential areas. That's also a way to kind of count additional units in the county, especially areas that have a higher density, but maybe only one unit is built on the property, but there's room to build additional units. We've identified those areas, and we've identified maybe a few neighborhoods where we could increase the densities. And I know that's one thing we did not do countywide, but maybe there's one or two few neighborhoods that can be done. Another strategy is looking at commercial sites and allow for an opportunity for mixed use development. Maybe a portion of the site could be built for residential and allow still some commercial uses, whether like on the ground floor or adjacent to the residential use. Another strategy is the religious institutions. Now, this one is really building upon existing state law that just recently passed. And the state law, what it does is give these churches and religious institutions a little bit of flexibility on what they can build on their vacant land or parking lots, particularly the parking lots. If a church has a large parking area, the state says that they can build parking on their, or I'm sorry, they can build housing on their parking, but the state is not requiring the jurisdiction to replace 50% of the parking. So if they build half of their parking lot with housing, any type of housing, they don't have to replace the parking. Now, if they did the whole parking area, they would have to replace at least 50% of the parking. So we're looking at that as a strategy. We're not forcing any churches out, but again, allowing them flexibility to provide some housing if they decide to choose to do so. School sites are another strategy. If there's a school that closed or reused it as another use, we're taking a look at those sites and see if there's housing opportunities on those sites. And then the last strategy is conversion, potentially, typically for affordable housing. But let's say there's an existing building like a motel or an older structure that has some vacant building area on the upper floors. Could those be converted to housing? Could the motel be converted to housing? So these are, again, opportunities to kind of increase and identify ways to find housing in Marin County, but also check off against that RHNA number, that 3,569 unit number. Next slide. So we have begun to identify sites. I'm going to show you some tools on the sites we've identified. But to identify those sites, I do want to make a point that we've conducted an extensive analysis looking throughout the county. We've identified all the hazard areas, access to infrastructure, services. We looked at all the different types. What areas allow zoning? What are the densities for those different zoning that allows units? And so we've, again, begun an extensive analysis throughout the county. When we do have identified our what we're calling our candidate sites, they will be analyzed through an environmental impact report and to understand what are the potential impacts of new housing in the county. And that environmental impact report will look at all types of factors, wildfire, biological impacts, traffic impacts, infrastructure, all types of areas to review what are the impacts of this new potential housing. So we will, part of the housing element update is bring forward an environmental impact report as well. Next slide. I want to briefly talk about realistic capacity assumptions and what does that mean and what is that? HCD is, again, wants the jurisdiction, the County of Marin, to identify the sites. And so we've begun to preliminary identify them. However, each site can yield a different housing unit. And so what the state is asking to do is make sure that we're using a realistic capacity and assumptions to identify that the site that we've identified, how many units can you get out of it? And is it realistically, can that be built over the next cycle for the housing element? So basically over the next 8 years. So the example I gave earlier, the vacant residential land, obviously we want to know, is it vacant? And if it is vacant, what are the constraints on that property? Are there biological resources? Are there steep terrain? The vacant size has so many units, or I'm sorry, if the vacant site is so many acres and we can build so many units, but again, if part of this property it has steep slopes, maybe you can't get the full amount of number of units. So we're making reductions so that we have a realistic capacity, so that when HCD reviews the site and they say, yes, there is constraints and we didn't use the maximum allowed units to be built on that, or that would be allowed on that particular site. Same thing for underutilized residential. If there's existing residential, what are some of the criteria or factors we use to count units? We looked at lot sizes. We made sure if it allows more units, we selected sites that maybe just have one existing unit as opposed to 5 or 10 that are probably unlikely to redevelop. And then one factor we definitely looked at is a building to land value ratio. And let me explain that real briefly. That's basically what we did is looked at the assessor data, and we looked at what the value is, the assessed value of the property, and we compared it to the assessed value of the improvement, which is the building. And so when we divide the two, if we divide the building by the land, if you get a high ratio, that means that the property owner recently put in a lot of investments onto that property. Maybe they built a new unit on there. They spent a lot of money upgrading the building or commercial facility. So we tend to not choose those sites because in the short term, they probably won't get redeveloped. There might be loans to pay off those improvements. If the ratio is really, really low, that means potentially the property owner hasn't invested any money in that property maybe the last 20 or 30 years. So those become more potential, or they're more ripe for redevelopment. So both for residential and commercial sites that we have identified, we want to make sure we looked at that they had a low building to land value ratio if they have existing buildings, residential or commercial on site. And then in terms of underutilized non-residential, which is basically commercial sites, shopping centers, we did select obviously larger sites, or if we can group them to make a larger sites if they're owned by multiple owners. If we use the mixed use factor, how much is it going to be residential versus how much of it's going to be commercial? And then the religious institutions, again, we only counted the parking lots. We didn't count any of the church buildings. And then we only counted 50% of the parking areas because of that requirement of replacing parking. Joan, next slide. We did an analysis of the existing zoning and countywide plan. And we do recognize that based off the existing information, we are short in terms of the lower and moderate income sites, well short. So we do recognize that we do have to do some rezoning of the properties at a higher density to meet the lower income sites. And we were really, really short. So those are areas that we do identify for higher income and higher densities. We did identify those sites, and those will be part of the candidate sites. And ultimately, when we narrow it down, we'll select some of those sites as well. Joan, next slide.
Okay. Oops. Let's see. Yeah. So it's this
Sorry,
one. Here we go. My mistake.
Getting close to the end. I appreciate everyone's patience. So one thing I want to make clear is, like I said, we've done an extensive analysis throughout the county. We've identified many, many sites, actually well more sites than we actually need. But what we wanted to do is give the communities, the public, an opportunity to identify what sites you think are make sense to provide housing, and maybe sites that don't make sense. We want to hear from you. We do have some tools to provide some information about particular sites. And so I think that's one of the key things is the county, the consultants have selected many sites. And so our goal over the next several months is to start to whittle that number down to get close to that 3,569 number. So that's part of going to be this process. And I'm going to talk about how do we whittle those sites down. So first thing is we've identified 4 scenarios to kind of help identify how the different sites are distributed throughout the county and how they reflect different guiding principles. So if you recall, there was the guiding principles I talked about earlier. We turned 4 of them into scenarios that'll help with the selection process and whittling down the number of units. So obviously one of the scenarios is ensuring countywide distribution. Do we want to make sure we have sites throughout the county and counting them in different areas of the county, the inland areas and rural areas, the bay areas, the city center areas? Another scenario is addressing racial equity and historic patterns of segregation. Do we want to identify lower income sites in areas that already have higher areas of lower income or higher areas with population of a higher, have more minority population? Or do we want to move those elsewhere? So those are things to consider. Encouraging infill. Do we want to put most of the units in the city center areas where there's, again, as I mentioned, closer to the freeways, closer to the job opportunities, closer to the cities? Is that a priority? Or do we want to make sure we take out sites that really have or can be affected by environmental hazards, sea level rise, the wildfire, flooding? We've identified some sites in those particular areas, but should those be removed? Or do we look at different approaches on how to address those over the long term if sites are included in those areas? And then all 4 scenarios do take advantage of leveraging surplus sites. And again, the key thing is just getting input from the community and through public engagement. Next slide. All right. So as I mentioned, we have many sites. What we want to do is whittle that process down. We do have one tool to help us with that, and it's called Balancing Act. So I'm going to do a quick demo to walk through Balancing Act. And as someone mentioned earlier in the chat, I noticed is that, hey, wait a minute, Balancing Act doesn't have all of the sites in Lucas Valley and actually in Marin County. The software does, technically, we were only supposed to, they recommend only using 15 sites. I think we've added like 30, almost close to 40 sites. And I'll walk you through those. There is another tool that's going to be available very soon. I'm thinking in the next day or so, that has all the sites. It also has all the hazards and information. And so we'll be able to look at all the sites and provide comments on those as well. So with that, let's walk through the Balancing Act. Let me do a quick demo here real quick. Joan, I'm going to, give me 1 sec. Let me move
grab the screen, let me know.
Okay. So how do we get to the Balancing Act website, webpage? So if you go to the County of Marin website, where the housing and safety element webpage is located, and particularly with the links to the meetings that, that you've accessed, if you scroll down a little bit more, you'll see 4 icons. One of them is called Balancing Act that has a scale. And if you click on that, that'll take you to the Balancing Act setup page. I do also want to identify the interactive atlas that'll be coming soon, and you'll be able to access there, but I'll do a quick demo of that one as well. And that one's ready for launch. So if we click on the Balancing Act, you'll scroll down, there's some information, but we've divided it into those 4 scenarios: ensure countywide distribution, addressing racial equity, the infill, and considering environmental hazards. So if you click one scenario that you think is important to you and you want to provide comments to that particular scenario, you can click on the link. So if you click on the link, I'm going to jump to it. It will take you to the Balancing Act website. There is a information page that talks about the 4 scenarios, a little bit of background about this process, and there's some questions it asks you. but you can zoom in and take a look at some of the sites. I'm going to zoom into the Lucas Valley area. And you can see we have a couple sites identified. And I know someone mentioned there's a couple more sites. I'll show you another tool where you can be able to comment on those. But one of the sites is the Juvenile Hall site. So if you click on that, if you want to provide comments, you can add a comment saying, you know what, that site, I don't agree with that site for this many reasons. We suggest, based on the analysis I talked about, we calculated about 150 units, and on this scenario considers 150. Another scenario may have a little bit more, a little bit less. But if you think, oh, I think that site can hold more units or can hold less units, you can make that change, and you can click on it and you can say, well, that can hold more units, or I think that site should probably be less units. And as you make that change, you can see on the top it turns red, and then now we're short. If you reduce too many units, you'll fall short. So maybe you want to take a look at another site where you may want to add additional units. What we're looking for is, obviously we want to have a housing plan, so we want something that at least meets that 3,569 number. And so you can zoom in throughout the county and provide comments on the sites that we've identified here. And each one you can play around with the number of units and provide text comments. If you want to comment on this particular scenario, you can add a comment and write your comment down. Then you can also share it on Facebook and other social media tools to let other people know about this tool. Once you're all done and you've selected, identified a plan, you can submit, and that information will come to staff so we can review it. And again, what this tool will help us do is identify, hey, which sites the public really identified as potentially a good site, or what site, no, they didn't like this particular site. So we want to get as much input as we can so that we can start to whittle down that number and meet that housing number. As I did mention, there is another site that will be officially public in the next couple of days, and this is the Atlas. And this Atlas has all of the housing sites on them. Again, Balancing Act doesn't have all the sites just because it's not the tool to add so many sites. The Balancing Act staff was concerned that we had too many sites on there, but we feel that it's workable. This site does have all of the sites. If we were to zoom into the Lucas Valley area, you could see that all of the sites are in here. If you click on it, it does identify the housing unit potential, the maximum housing unit potential. In some cases, we may go with a lower number. And then you can also compare it to these different tabs at the top. There's a community profile tab that has various information. This one shows population density, job proximity data. And so you can start to see the different sites and how various information and how that site plays into various information. I think many people will be interested on some of the physical and community constraints, infrastructure, schools, transit, as well as hazards. We do recognize that many sites do have some hazards. We have some sea level rise data, flooding data. You can begin to overlay the data, and it provides information. I think the key thing on this site is if you click on the site and get the number, you can send a map. You do have to put in the map code to identify a comment that you want to add to a particular site. And again, that will be available on one of the 4 icons on the county's website. So with that, I'm going to turn presentation back over to Joan. Thanks, Joan.
Okay, well, thank you, Jose. I also want to thank Lily and Jillian for answering questions in the chat. We're going to start taking your questions and comments, and we'll use the hands raised feature, and I'll take them the order that they show up on my Zoom participant list. There was one question in the chat that staff weren't able to answer completely. They weren't, the person was seeking a clarification about why would I think it had to do with the land to building ratio, Laura Drossman. So we're trying to respond to your question about why would you exclude it because the ratio is so high? Is that what you were talking about, the land to building ratio?
Yes, it sounded like areas would be excluded from consideration for these sites based on the fact that there had been investment by owners in their own property. And the result of that one result of that would be you would kind of be favoring areas with wealthier owners as opposed to our area that has a lot of older fixed income residents who may not have funds to do that. And so that targets our area more than other areas. That was my point there.
Okay.
So I think it might have some unintended effects.
Okay. And I don't know, Jose, if you want to add any additional explanation there or.
No, we do recognize if, and there, it's not necessarily areas, it's definitely the property or the building. So if you're right, if there is a site that has a building on there and it has a high building to land value ratio, you will probably take it out. Now, the state does recognize that as a criteria for selecting sites. And so here's an example. Let's say there's a brand, and this is just kind of just a random example, but if there's a brand new shopping center and it had a, obviously the cost to build that is really, really high. The building land value ratio is going to be super, super high. So obviously we don't want to include that. Now, if there's an older shopping center that has a lot of vacancies, the property owner hasn't redeveloped it, and then the building land value ratio is going to be lower. So that site potentially, again, this is all going to be, it's all pursuant to a property owner wanting to develop their site in the first place. So those are the considerations we take into consideration. But just in terms of the distribution of lower income and higher income, HCD, the state does recognize putting sites in areas that have low resources and high resources in terms of education, income, employment opportunities. That has to factor in it. So the state does not want to put all the affordable housing sites in one particular area that has maybe low resources or less investments. So we do have to take that into account.
Okay.
Yeah, I just think that you should, if I can just say, I'm a real estate lawyer and a real estate broker, and I live and work in Marin County. And I'm telling you that these areas with high concentration of investment are not being identified as the potential sites in the portions of unincorporated Marin County that are the subject here. There's an extreme concentration in our area. And I think that this has to do with it, that there's a lot of older residents who are original owners and not a lot of development and and then public areas like the Juvenile Hall, which we all know has been falling into disrepair for many years. So this one factor does, I don't want to say unfairly because I know there's a whole, but there is something to that, because if you look in unincorporated areas of, say, Tiburon, there are no identified sites in the same levels of density or with low income as they are in Lucas Valley. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Laura. We appreciate that. Okay, so I'm going to take either a comment or a question. Diane Henderson is first.
Thank you. And thank you all for doing this. I know you're doing road shows all over the county, and it's really helpful to have this information. I have a question on balancing act, and I've been on the site several times and just kind of playing around with it. But it seems to me the 4 scenarios are based on the guiding principles that the Board of Supervisors adopted: the equity, environmental hazards, countywide distribution, and infill, I think is the 4th. But each of those, when you go on the balancing act, each of those scenarios is mutually exclusive. And when you are developing a plan for the county, in fact, all those principles are going to weigh in. And I'm not clear why that tool, it's broken down that way, rather than, because in real life, we have to balance all those things. And it's not clear to me. That's one question I have. And the other one, if you could just indicate, you've said you're going to use that information from the Balancing Act as public input, but I'm just wondering, couldn't people go in and really sway numbers, use it multiple times, have people from all over that don't even live in
Okay.
the county use it, et cetera.
Yeah, so Diane, your second question, we've discussed what we have in place to respond to that. I'm going to have Jose start this, and then Jillian is also very expert with balancing act as well. And if she wants to add anything, please do. Go ahead, Jose.
Well, I'll try to answer the second part first, and then I'll go back to the first one. In terms of people logging in multiple times, we do get information on, particularly when it's been submitted. We can tell if there's one computer that's been submitted multiple times. Yes, you're right. Someone can go in and click on the sites, but in addition to the numbers that you can change, we're also looking for the qualitative comments as well. And we're just going to take all the data we can holistically, but we're also taking in all comments from all the community meetings. And so there'll be definitely a comprehensive approach in terms of how we are looking at all the various sites. And going back to your first question on how are the scenarios developed, and they're kind of exclusive from each other. So yes, the scenarios are based off the guiding principles. And so what we did was we wanted a way for the public to weigh in on some of those guiding principles. And we don't know which one is going to be prioritized more than another. It's ultimately going to be weighed by the Board of Supervisors. We want to provide them feedback and say, hey, maybe it's a combination of a couple of the guiding principles or the scenarios. And so we want at least the community to provide comments on those scenarios and say, hey, I value the development in the infill areas, or I value the environmental constraints as being a factor in recognizing sites. So we definitely want the input on the different scenarios because we think that's important to help whittle the number down.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And Jillian, did you want to add anything?
Sorry, Joan, I was going to add something just quickly about the trade-offs. The goal is that each of the scenarios takes into consideration all of the 6 guiding principles or the 5 guiding principles that are that the board and planning commission considered, but each of those scenarios kind of highlights that one issue as the main one. And then what we intend is that we'll take all of this information that we hear from the public as we do the road shows, from the balancing act information, and then present it to the board. And it will likely be that they'll have some scenario that will come out of that will be a combination of, as you mentioned, a combination of those different scenarios based on the feedback that we receive. Thanks. Back to you, Joan.
Okay, thank you, Lily. So the next hand up is Paul Jensen.
Hi, good evening, Joan and Jose. Thank you very much for the presentation. And Lily and Jillian, I'm big fans of you guys and you do a terrific job. Thank you very much for putting this together. I just want to make a few comments. I'm a long-term resident of Marinwood. I first moved here in 1980 when there used to be a pharmacy in the shopping center, among other uses that were neighborhood serving, and a gas station on that side. So I know how it's evolved over time, and that's where I want to focus my comments. I do believe that the Marinwood Shopping Center is probably the best housing opportunity site in the Marinwood-Lucas Valley area, primarily because it's along the 101 corridor. We all know that the countywide plan has focused development along the 101 corridor since 1972. What I would like you guys to take a look at is possibly maybe working with Public Works to see if there is a possibility to choke down the width of Marinwood Avenue south of Miller Creek Road to perhaps capture more land area for housing development at that shopping center. And the reason why I mention that is that road is excessively wide. It was built at a time in the original master plan that Jerry Hoyt had that was going to connect Marinwood Avenue to Lucas Valley Road. And what it serves now and what it will serve, which is ultimately just the shopping center and the new assisted living facility in Casa Marinwood, doesn't warrant a road that wide. So there's some opportunities there to maybe boost those numbers. I do want to make one comment about St. Vincent's. I totally understand revisiting St. Vincent's as a housing opportunity site, but please keep in mind that it is outside the CSD, the Marinwood CSD, and utilities, services, infrastructure will have to be extended. Yet I look and I read about the seminary property in Strawberry, and it's identified as a credit site merely because it has an application on file. And frankly, that is a far better site for housing because it already has urban services. So those are my comments. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for your comments, Paul. Our next commenter is Stephen Nessel.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you for opportunity to speak. If you've been following the chat, I've been asking lots of questions. I'll try not to repeat myself, but the key question that I have is there's another document that I found on the community development planning site. It's called Candidate Housing Sites, and it is for Marinwood Lucas, well, not specifically for Marinwood Lucas Valley, but for all of unincorporated Marin. It is 2,248 apartments on that list, that official document that you published about a week after our last meeting. The Balancing Act, which you've admitted is not all the housing sites available. It has about 542 housing units. Now, I don't know what kind of information you hope to achieve, what the purpose of this Balancing Act is, if it's just a parlor game where we can play around with numbers. I don't know, but it doesn't seem like it's going to produce any useful, meaningful input. And I wrote to the Community Development Department 3 times. I finally got a response a day ago. And I got to say, the answer was a bit obscure. So I'm ready to listen. Why are we looking at such small numbers on the Balancing Act and large numbers in your official documents?
Okay. So Stephen, how about if we stop and I'll let Lily respond?
I'll start and then Jose may want to add. So the Balancing Act is one of the tools that we have for people to be able to look at what are some of the trade-offs that are going to have to be made as we select sites. So the Balancing Act isn't the only way to provide comments. It is one of the tools. So there's also a map that you can add additional sites. If you think that there's ones that are missing, you can comment on each of them. And so that is a tool for doing that. Another way for commenting on sites and providing feedback is through the meetings like this. Balancing Act is a tool that has been used in a number of other jurisdictions, usually smaller ones, like Fairfax is also using it. They have 8 sites. That's the total number of sites. And so for them, Balancing Act was a much more, it was easier for them to use because they had a fewer number of sites. We started out with our whole list of sites, all 150 sites, and the tool doesn't work to add all of them. So what we did is say, let's put them in, let's put some sites in so that people can understand kind of what some of those trade-offs are and have that experience of what it's like, where you're like, I think they shouldn't be at this site. And then what does that mean? That means they're going to have to go somewhere else. And so it's just that idea of these are some of the trade-offs and being able to provide that feedback about what is the issue that is most important to you? Is it that we address patterns of discrimination in our communities, or is it that we should divide units as equally as we can throughout the community? What's important to you? And so that's the other piece of Balancing Act. Sorry, the answer was longer than I had meant it to be. I don't know, Jose, if you had anything you want to add.
No, nothing. No, you.
Yeah, so basically Balancing Act is not the definitive tool. It is one of several tools that will inform the site selection process.
Don't you think it distorts the information though? If we still have 2,200 units in play here, you're putting out information that just, it's really not accurate at all. I'm sorry. I just think we deserve better quality discussion than a very limited menu of choices. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Our next commenter is Alex Lawrence. Alex, please go ahead. Alex, we're not hearing your voice if you're speaking.
Should we come back to Alex?
Yeah, we'll keep Alex's hand up. So how about if we move to Andre? Andre Swang, please go ahead.
Hi, actually, I sent the comment or my question to Lily and Jose directly. If you guys are commenting on it, maybe, do you want me to read that or do you want to?
Please go ahead and read it. It's hard to monitor direct
Mhm.
messages and pay attention.
So it's been commented that these are supposed to be realistic capacity assumptions. But in order for that to happen, you need developers and builders. This critical piece does not seem to be considered. It seems that there is a number counting desire here to meet the required state numbers, but realistic must include actual ability to build. Marin County makes it extremely difficult to do this. So what will be done for the development to actually happen and not just have paper conjecture to fulfill the needs of the state requirements?
Okay, so Lily, I think maybe I'll put that one in your court.
Yeah, I can start with that. So the housing element, in addition to the sites that are identified, and that's where most of the attention goes, but the housing element also includes programs and policies and a constraints analysis. And in the constraints analysis, we need to evaluate what constraints are there to development of housing at all income levels, particularly, and what constraints are there to affordable housing. And then the programs and policies in the housing element have to address those constraints. So if, for example, height limits was a constraint, then that is something that we would need to address. So the programs and policies is where those type of constraints that you're mentioning would be addressed. The other constraint, of course, is going to be water. And I know that a number of people asked this, so I'm going to just address it, even though it's not your specific question, but a lot of people have asked about, how are we going to add more housing when we are in a drought and there is water shortages that we're facing, something that I, have spent a lot of time thinking about. And we've talked to the water district and we'll continue consulting with them. And one of the things that they're looking at is adding, most of our water in Marin, our fresh water, is used for landscaping. And our county doesn't do a very good job on recycling water. There's a lot of other communities around California that have a much more aggressive water recycling program. So that's likely something that could be pursued. And that's a way that we may address some of the water needs of the new housing. So sorry to answer a question that wasn't exactly yours, Andre, but yes, the constraints are there.
And
Obviously, go ahead, Jose.
I was going to answer one part of your question. I'm looking at the text now, but you said that you need developers and builders to build, or that's a critical piece that's needed.
You can't have the housing unless they're involved.
Well, let me clarify that. Housing law, what the county is responsible for doing is making sure that they have the zoning and land use in place to be able to meet that 3,000 number. The county is not responsible for building the number of housing. It's going to be the responsibility of the property owners and then the builders. So the county is just basically responsible to make sure that the zoning's in place, the regulatory environment's in place, so that number can be attained over the housing element cycle.
And I understand that, but that's my very question. I am a developer.
Okay.
I own a lot of real estate in the Bay Area. And the thing with Marin County is you can have all these policies, but there are stop signs, 1,000 stop signs to being able to say yes. So this, my thing is, if this is a paper exercise, you guys are doing great. But as you said, during the previous 8-year cycle, only 247 units were built. That tells you something. That's my comment.
I would just say that what Lily said earlier about the constraints analysis is going to be really, really important.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next we have Linda Howman.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you first to MIG for all your work and to Lily Thomas for all your good work. I just want to let you all know, it's more of a comment. I'm a 28-year resident of Marinwood. We raised our children here. We really love it here. And I also recognize that we need more affordable housing. We have a workforce crisis for housing here in Marin. And as we are all aging, we need essential workers to care for us. So I would like to see, I can walk to the Juvenile Hall area. I can walk to Marinwood Plaza. This is my home. And I would love to see, Mr. Jensen also mentioned I think we need to revisit the redevelopment of Marinwood Plaza. When that supermarket moved in, I think they were promised that there would be housing to support them. I support them, but we need to do that. I know there's a toxic issue there, but that could be, mitigated. So those two areas I'm in favor of, and thank you for all your good work.
Okay, thank you for your comment, Linda. Alex Lawrence, we're coming back to you to see if you're free to make your comment or question now. Okay, Alex, we're still not hearing you. Okay, so you're back on mute. I'm going to go to our next commenter, Robert Pendoli. You're next.
I think that's John.
Sorry, I didn't have my hand up.
Oh, no, it's John.
Oh,
John has John Reynolds.
Oh, okay, my apologies.
Yeah,
if you
go
want
ahead,
to go
John Reynolds.
You hear me now? Okay. Yeah, Lily, I appreciate you and appreciate the other folks that are running this webinar. It's very helpful for us, I think, to look at the possibilities we have going forward. Long time ago, I was part of the process to see if we could do a community in St. Vincent Sylvia area. Remember that? I don't know, that's a long time ago. And I know that it's agricultural use for the farm there, I understand. But actually, is it the St. Vincent, the St. Vincent Home for Boys that you're talking about as a possibility? Is that what I'm thinking about that? And I really am very strong with Linda and Paul Jensen about Marinwood. But we tried to do that several years ago, and there was the toxicity issue that Linda mentions, but that can be dealt with. But it would be great to provide that kind of a place for people to live, seniors, older people, people that could care for them in that area, and a grocery store there, not a big one. That would be an ideal place to continue to have affordable housing there for seniors and other people who need affordable housing. So I would support Paul Jensen and Linda Hallman that raised that up.
Okay, well, thank you for your comment. So Alex, we're going to try again. So you are off mute. So hopefully you'll be able to make your comment. And Alex, maybe you can send us a message in the chat so we can find out your status. Try again. Okay, no, you're back on mute again. Okay, next we'll take a comment or a question from Siggy.
It's a quick question. The area on the Juvenile Hall, will this new development replace the Juvenile Hall, or will it be on the unbuilt parts of that parcel?
Let's see. Would that be Jose? Do you want to speak to that site, or do we want Lily to respond first?
Well, I can respond, and then Lily can jump in afterwards. We did not. We looked at the entire site, but we did not include the area that has the buildings. So the area that does have the unbuilt areas or the site that we looked at for potentially for housing potential?
I don't have anything to add. I think that answers the question.
Okay. Let's see, we have about 3 or 4 more minutes, and I know we just have 2 quick slides that we want to do as well. There's a hand from Paul Benton.
Hey, everybody. Thanks, team, for this really productive process. I have 2 questions. One is, I notice in a couple meetings that I've attended that there seems to be a disproportionate and huge, relative to other sites, placing within Lucas Valley. My question is that an accurate perception? And secondly, why?
I'll take that. And then
Okay.
you can add anything, Jose. So I would say, yes, it's an accurate perception in some of the scenarios there. And the reason why, and then I'll add some more. The reason why is that is really based on the number of parcels and the developable parcels that are in that area. So there was some large properties that had more development potential. And so that is the reason why. However, in one of our scenarios in the equal distribution, we have adjusted the numbers down so that it is not, so there's more of an equal distribution, and there's not such a high percentage in the Marinwood Lucas Valley area. So if you wanted to comment on that, then, looking at the Balancing Act tool is a good way of doing that. And we've had a significant number of folks fill out that tool, but that's really the answer to your question. I don't know, Jose, if you wanted to add anything.
No, and that basically responds to one of the chat questions about why does the Juvenile Hall have 140 and the website shows 246. The maximum number of units for the Juvenile Hall is the 246 number, but like Lily said, if we were to equal distribute them, other areas in the Balancing Act could take up more sites, so therefore less was needed at the Juvenile Hall site. So again, that's the whole guiding principles and how the scenarios are different. So you can comment on how that differs.
Okay, well, thanks, Jose. So we're coming close to the end of our time. We have a hand from Isabel Finney, and then I think we'll have our wrap-up slides. So Isabel, please go ahead.
Sorry, it's not Isabel. This is her husband,
Okay.
Dennis. I'm using her link. But anyway, my question just is about the water. And Lily mentioned about you doing more recycling for landscaping, but it really doesn't answer the question about usable fresh water. And it would be really helpful, I think, for maybe all Californians. I grew up in the 70s during the California drought then, to really see a robust, where is it really going to come from? And what is it going to be storage? Is it extra capacity? But I would love to see real water engineering, like maybe people from Marin Water District, like a really robust answer to that question of where additional water, if it's not here already, where's it going to come from for 3,600 or 569 more families?
Yes, I think that we need to have that conversation and really considering all of those things that you mentioned, and I think that when I was talking about the recycled water, it's so that you could use all of that water that was being used, that fresh water could then be used for serving some of those families or some of those households. So that is one of the ways. There's other conversations around water that are happening, and obviously it's something that we need to have as a whole state. It's not just this county. And looking at some of those infrastructure dollars for improving, as you said, storage, recycled water, purple pipe. So looking at all of those packages, I think that definitely is a conversation then, and we need to do some more analysis on it. So yes, that is an issue that needs to be faced. We did ask the state about it because we started this process when we were in that, the drought was even more severe than it was. And we started this process and wondered, what if we don't have the water capacity? What do we do as far as continuing with the planning? And the answer was, you need to have you need to have programs in your housing element. If you don't have adequate water supply to meet your demand, to meet your RHNA, your regional housing need allocations, then you need to have a program that says we're going to increase our capacity, or we're going to increase recycling so that we can use some of that water. So yes, we have to look at all of those things.
Okay, well, thanks, Lily. That's going to bring us to the end of our presentation and discussion today. We appreciate all of the questions and comments that have come in through the chat. And just to close us out today, just want to remind people that if Balancing Act has piqued your interest and you'd like some one-on-one assistance on how to use the tool, staff are available for virtual office hours. So the link to get to the office hours is on the Housing Safety Element page web link. So that's where you can find that information. And just a reminder that this is one of several opportunities that we have been out in the community sharing information and receiving your feedback. So with that, we're finished with our presentation, and I want to turn it back to Lily for final closing comments.
Thank you, Joan, and thanks, Jose and Jillian, for your help tonight. Thanks, everybody, for being here. We really appreciate your comments and your time. And I would just like to note that this is we're in the process of it. The sites haven't been selected. There's more opportunities for providing input. As we mentioned, there's the online tools. We have meetings coming up with the board and the Planning Commission in March, and we welcome your continued input and feedback. And again, thank you for your time tonight.
Okay, and the link to the Balancing Act Zoom is in the chat. So thank you for your time, and we are adjourned this evening. Good night.